Well, Rita Hayworth was my first real love.
Has to be Alec Guinness.
Sean Connery.
James Stewart.
I like The Lion King.
Dilip Kumar.
Se llama Santiago Segura.
Zero Mostel is my favourite comedy star.
I like Marlene Dietrich.
The one I remember being involved with earliest was John Wayne.
You want to be like him, talk like him, maybe walk like him as well.
Of course, he's so enigmatic and mysterious, perhaps.
And I think I was probably introduced to him by my mum, who fancied him as well.
He kind of represented a lot of things that I would like in a man.
I can't remember not knowing who he was. I mean, I knew him as soon as I could speak. I knew that name. As soon as I could read.
Look at me, Max Bialystock. Max Bialystock, 6 shows on Broadway. 6 shows on Broadway.
He's kind of sitting at the bar and he's rolling an egg on the bar. This guy, the barman says, "Oh, what can I get for you?" And he kind of goes, "Oh, what do you got in mind?"
So I don't see there's such a thing, or such a person as Greta Garbo. That's just a creation of the cinema.
Babe. And that was about them all.
It's been said that a movie star is someone we remember after we've forgotten the movies they were in. The sound of their voice, their faces and bodies take on associations and meanings all of their own. They become icons. This film is about the first screen icon from Scotland. His name was Eric Campbell, but it is the face, not the name, that people remember. He was the ultimate silent comedy villain, appearing opposite Charlie Chaplin in 11 films between 1916 and 1918, before mysteriously vanishing from movies forever. Who was this Scotsman who was known and loved by millions around the world? Where did he come from? Where did he go?
It's lovely to be here, everyone, and welcome also to this very important occasion. I think it's weird and rather wonderful that here we are standing in the rain in Dunoon in Scotland, celebrating one of the great figures of international cinema, particularly that part of cinema which really dominated the world, the silent period. As you all know, in the silent period, cinema had no language barriers, and so the stars of silent cinema were famous in Beijing, in Tokyo, in South America, in North America. And here we are, roughly 80 years after his death, celebrating someone who would have been recognised all around the world, perhaps one of the most recognised people on the planet. That what we're doing this morning will thankfully help rehabilitate him for Scots, and we can call him again one of our own. And I'll say no more on the subject except to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome to Scotland and to Dunoon Eric's granddaughter Brenda Bull.
Well, it's nice to have been found.
Yes, off we go.
When I watch him on the screen, to me, it seems so strange that, never having met him, to think that it is actually my grandfather. It's difficult to relate to. When I was a child, my mother told me all about my grandfather and showed me pictures, but it wasn't until I was a schoolgirl that at a local specialised cinema, they had a series of Charlie Chaplin films, and she took me to see him then. That was the first time I'd ever seen a moving picture of him.
And what did you think of them?
Well, I was astonished at the time because I was only about 12, and I was surprised how tall and enormous he was, because I didn't realise until you actually see it on the screen compared with the size of other people how large he was in all width-wise and height-wise.
I first saw the Chaplin films wearing my hat as a film buff in the old Pathoscope 9.5 films where Charlie Chaplin was king and Eric Campbell was his stooge. And I was very, very surprised to learn Campbell was in fact from my neck of the woods, so to speak. He was born fairly late into the 19th century. I think it was about 1880, 1885 or so. I think Dunoon in these days must have been very much what was called Dunoon. In other words, Glaswegians came here in great, great numbers for their holidays. Everybody piled down to Dunoon. There were many, many steamers, and these steamers used to carry people literally packed like sardines across the water for their couple of weeks' holiday in Dunoon. And of course, in these days, the clan system, I won't say it was still the full clan system, but there would have been a very large number of Campbells in this district because it is Campbell territory. But I've had quite a few bits and pieces of trying to trace him, and I've literally drawn a blank.
Whatever his beginnings, Eric later said that he was obsessed with acting from a very early age. In his only known piece of autobiography, he wrote, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be an actor. My first appearance on any stage was at the age of 8 in a children's operetta called 5 O'Clock Tea. I played a Chinaman. As I grew older, my desire to become an actor deepened, much to the annoyance of my parents, who had mapped out a scientific career for me. I studied for about 3 years, but my mind was more on grease paint than on gases. I had very bad luck at first, but very good experience. I played in the Scotch and Welsh fit-ups with terrible melodramas. It was difficult at first to be convincing in these, to me, very unnatural roles, but I realised that the class of people we played to believed them.
Fit-ups, were called that because you virtually went into a bare hall and you fitted up the scenery, and every play it was a fit-up. And the kind of things they did there were plays, melodramas, Murder in the Red Barn, Maria Monk, Jeannie Deans. They were all very well-known pieces, and some actors did nothing else but that. And others who came into it didn't know what to do. Didn't realise it wasn't always what was written down on the page. You sometimes made it up as you went along, so he had to learn to use his brain, you see. And of course, in those places, the actors were lucky, some of them, if they got 30 shillings a week. It was a pretty thin existence.
Eric spent several years scraping a living with the touring fit-up companies. And perhaps it was during one of these engagements that he met Gertrude Rowbotham, a pretty Lancashire actress a few years older than himself. Eric and Gertrude were married in April 1901. Interestingly, their marriage certificate suggests that the pair eloped. At 20, Eric was still technically a minor, so he claimed that he was 27. And perhaps to cover his tracks, he also stated that his profession was commercial traveller. A year later, a daughter named Una was born, who was soon to become the apple of her father's eye. Eric continued to appear in the so-called legitimate theatre, in productions such as this Egyptian mummy melodrama staged in Glasgow in 1908. But aided by a fine baritone voice, he also began to get jobs as a singer in musicals and in operetta. In later life, he claimed to have worked with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company. This is Eric Campbell, but is it D'Oyly Carte? However, the area in which Eric was really to make his name was the weird and wonderful world of music hall.
The music hall of the end of the last century, the beginning of this century, was really a theatre like nothing else. For one thing, it was a completely democratic theatre. I mean, there really were the groundlings. Up in the gallery, you only needed a penny or something, but in the boxes, there'd be the toffs and the gentry. At that period, every town had its music hall, and I mean, the bigger towns had a number of music halls. So an amazing number of artists were employed. The audience just demanded the extraordinary. It didn't matter what it was if it was extraordinary. I mean, you would have Pavlova and you would have Sarah Bernhardt on the music halls, side by side with Lockhart's Elephants or Performing Seals or something like that. Anything is extraordinary. There was even one act, actually it was an American act, I'm not sure if they appeared over here, but one act who was extraordinary, being so extraordinarily bad. They were called the Cherry Sisters, and they were so appallingly bad that people loved them because they were bad, and they loved throwing things at them. I mean, that was an act to have things thrown at it. To be a musical artist was the kind of ambition maybe kids now who would like to be pop stars. I mean, it was the same kind of impulsion to be a musical artist.
We had an act called Joe Slack and Eve. And Joe came on as a chef, the white hat, everything was marvellous, and he brought on a giant silver platter, and it was almost like as big as a stretcher, if you like, this giant platter, and he took the top off the platter, and there was actually his wife, Eve, as a chicken. And she was a contortionist, so he kind of swung her off this thing and swung her round by the ankle as though it was a chicken, and then she all sort of came to bits and worked, and it was a marvellous act.
At Christmas, every music hall staged an elaborate pantomime. Here's Eric as an imposing emperor of Morocco in a 1908 production of Dick Whittington at the Theatre Royal in Birmingham. It was while appearing in panto that Eric was spotted by the great Tsar of British music hall comedy, Fred Karno. Karno's individual blend of pantomime and physical comedy was to have a tremendous influence not only over Eric, but over whole generations of British and American comics. This rare piece of archive gives a fleeting glimpse of him with two of his later prodigies, Flanagan and Allen.
Well, this, though it doesn't look like very much at the moment, is in fact a very historic building in the story of British theatre, because this is Fred Karno's Fun Factory. Karno was an extraordinary figure. He was certainly the most important impresario of comedy in the English music halls, and that is the English music halls in their greatest days. Karno really invented the comedy sketch, the kind of comedy sketch which very much looked forward to the one and two reel slapstick comic films. Of course, the most important product of the Fun Factory were the comedians themselves, and this is where Karno really was a genius, because he had an incredible gift for spotting comedians and then for training them. And I think it's true to say that there was practically no English comedian from 1900 to 1930 who hadn't been through Karno's hands, and of course many of them finished up in America than they finished up in films, and it's marvellous to think that through this door they entered, full of fear and trembling, because Karno terrorizes people, but it's amazing to think that here was the young Charlie Chaplin and young Stan Laurel, and of course big Eric Campbell. And it's not a very big door. I think Eric might have had some problem getting through it even.
Karno recognised in Eric a performer whose enormous, threatening physical presence could be used to hilarious comic effect. In the Yap Yaps, Eric was cast as Big Ben the Bruiser, a bullying boxer. In a finale which always brought the house down, Big Ben and the diminutive lead comedian were brought together for a fight, with the little comedian finally winning the day. It's a scenario that clearly foreshadows the David and Goliath relationship Eric was to have with Chaplin. Over the next 4 years, Eric appeared in a number of other Karno shows, along the way befriending and working alongside the Chaplin brothers, Charlie and Sid, and the young Stan Laurel. In 1912, Stan Laurel and Charlie Chaplin were both part of a Carno tour of America, and both made the momentous decision to stay there, with Charlie entering movies with the Keystone Company the following year. It wasn't long before Eric would be joining them. Eric arrived in New York in July 1914, travelling first class aboard the aptly named SS Minnehaha. His ticket had been paid for by the most prominent American theatrical producers of the day, Klaw and Erlanger, who wanted him to play in their latest Broadway production, Tipping the Winner, a comedy about bookies and racehorses. The city Eric experienced was teeming with newly arrived immigrants, Italians, Russians, Germans, and not a few Scots, lured from their homelands by the promise of a better life. Unfortunately, Tipping the Winner was not a winner and closed after a dozen performances. But Eric's notices were good, and he had no difficulty finding work in a successful musical comedy, later boasting that he himself had written many of the best numbers in the show. By April 1915, Eric was settled enough to send for his wife and daughter, and by that time there was a good reason to stay away from Europe. The Great War had begun, and thousands of men of Eric's age were already losing their lives in the trenches of the Western Front. Unknown to Eric, an old Carno colleague was also in New York. Charlie Chaplin was now the most famous movie star in the world. Having just fulfilled a year's contract with the Essanay Film Company, he was in town with his brother Sid courting new offers. And on the 25th of February 1916, he signed an unprecedented contract with the Mutual Film Corporation to produce 12 two-reel comedies over 2 years, with a first year's paycheck of $625,000. At that time, the largest salary ever paid to an entertainer. Before returning to Hollywood, the Chaplins decided to take in a Broadway musical starring Mitzi Hayosh, the musical star of the moment. And there on the bill was their old friend Eric. They went backstage and immediately recruited him for their new venture. And so it was that Eric headed west to work in the movies in March 1916.
Hollywood at that time, like around 1915, was really a rather a bustling little community. I mean, you could say, well, it was a lazy town, but compared to 20 years before, it wasn't so lazy. So you had a great deal of laborers who were working, constructing homes and businesses. And I think the word humming might be right, as it was sort of a humming little community. A lot of avocado groves and citrus groves. People who first came here said one of the major things they remembered was the lovely scent of orange groves. And the movie business was like gold, of course. It was like a gold rush. And you had a great deal of people coming from the East Coast to the West Coast at that time. And there were probably about 20 or so studios, I would say, in the Hollywood and immediate vicinity.
Eric reported for work at the Lone Star Studios in April. A set depicting a department store was already under construction. Chaplin had gathered together a small stock company of actors who would appear in all of his Mutual films. His on-screen and off-screen lover was the beautiful blonde Edna Purviance, whose untutored acting style was to cause Chaplin numerous headaches, but also provide some of the most charming moments in his films. Of the others, several, like Eric, were old Carno hands, with little or no experience of film. This was a deliberate choice on Charlie's part. He was keen to move away from the simplistic slapstick of his early films and develop a more subtle, character-driven comedy style, based in large measure on what he had learned at Carno. Eric makes a dramatic entrance in The Floor Walker, his first film for Chaplin. He plays a corrupt store manager intent on embezzling a fortune from his employers. The striking makeup is already in evidence, but despite some music antics on the escalator, Eric's role is underdeveloped. The David and Goliath partnership with Chaplin that was to grow so familiar to film fans only began in their second film, The Fireman. By now, Eric was much more than a mere character actor. He was Chaplin's foil, a co-star, somebody whom the audience could always rely on to play variations on the same villainous role. Over the next 18 months, Eric and Charlie continued to battle it out in film after film. Eric showed himself to be a highly adaptable and agile performer for a man of 20 stone. Look at him in this scene where he thinks he's come across Charlie kissing a boy. Often it is Eric who steals the laughs by providing the toppers on Charlie's gags. Although now a recognised star player, Eric settled into a rather modest lifestyle with his family.
Yeah, this is a letter from my grandmother to her sister Clarice, and it's May the 28th, 1916. And it says, "My dear Clary, I don't know where to begin first. Glad to say we got the tie for Eric's birthday on the actual day. Eric was delighted. You know how he talks. Well, his latest craze is to get you all this side. Also, he's certain to be able to keep us all. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. If it had not been for our dreadful war, Eric would have scraped half the fare, he says. Well, we took a cottage at Santa Monica, about a mile from the famous sea beach down Los Angeles called Venice. We look out of the back door and see garden and lovely seafront, also perfectly quiet. Mind, it is a tumble-down cottage, small bedrooms, front room, and with the hire of the piano, chiefly for Eric's music. Now, I didn't know he played the piano. I knew he sang, didn't know he played the piano. It is half rent, so the other half keeps up the car, 13 miles from the studio. Eric goes each morning. They are on the third picture, an English gypsy part, no title yet. The Floor Walker must be on in London. I think it is in Australia, all America and Canada. And they have made now on his first picture his year's salary. Isn't it enormous? ? You said you enclosed a slip about Chaplin, but maybe this passing by the censor business got it lost. We are sorry because lots of stupid rumours get around. Already he wrote to England about the fighting business.
The British press gave Chaplin and his cohorts a tough time during the Great War for being in America. To try and demonstrate their patriotism, both Eric and Charlie were involved in a number of charity events. They boxed in aid of the French nurses and appeared together in a baseball game to raise war bonds. It was comedians versus tragedians with the Keystone Cops as umpires.
Grandpop talked a lot about the crew being a real family at that time, and certainly they would do things together. They went to the fights together. They went to baseball games together. They went out, he talked about, actually it was funny, when Bonnie and I were doing some research looking up information about Eric, we found out that there was mention of something that Grandpa talked about, going to Levy's Cafe. Apparently that was the normal hangout. So apparently it was quite a family affair in those days.
My name is Bonnie McCourt, and I am the founder of the Charlie Chaplin Film Company, and I publish something called Limelight, which is a quarterly publication strictly on the subject of Charlie Chaplin. And I've been a Chaplin fan since I was 11 years old. My parents had gotten divorced that year, and my mother and my brother and I moved in with my grandfather. And I was feeling a little lonely and, you know, sort of an outsider in a new town and didn't know anybody. So my father bought me a television set for Christmas. And the week between Christmas and New Year's, I was just flipping the channels and saw this little guy on roller skates. And he was so adorable and so graceful. And there was this huge, scary-looking man who was after him. And I just was so fascinated by this little man who managed to best this big bully who was not only after him, but after the woman, too. And here's this little guy literally skating circles around this big monster named Eric Campbell. And here this little guy just did whatever he could do to vanquish the villain and save the poor woman from this evil man. And as an 11-year-old, I just fell in love with this little character, and now, over 30 years later, I'm still entranced by these same films that I've seen hundreds of times.
Charlie was contracted by Mutual to produce one film a month. And at script meetings like this, Eric and other key members of the company were encouraged to come up with ideas for the next film. It was a hectic schedule, and inevitably delays began to occur.
He drove distributors absolutely crazy because he was every film took longer than the one before it, and they were waiting for delivery. So he drove them crazy. And the other thing which astounded people at the time was the number of takes that he would make of every scene, and he would shoot and shoot and shoot a scene over and over and over again until he got it right. And this was something completely new to filmmaking at that time.
Luckily for us, portions of the material Chaplin discarded, his outtakes, survive and provide tantalising glimpses behind the scenes. As in this shot, we see Eric taking a breather on the set of The Floorwalker. Elsewhere, we can see how a novel stunt was achieved. How, for instance, did enormous Eric manage this? Of course, it's not Eric, but a stuntman, who's been instructed to wave his legs around as long as he can, then hold them together when he needs to be rescued. And among those who rush to pull him out is Eric himself. The outtakes also provide insight into the way Charlie and Eric work together. At times, we see Charlie directing his heavy from the strangest positions. Frequently, Chaplin required take after take before he got the performances he wanted. In this case, a disdainful Edna rejecting Eric's romantic advances in The Adventurer, no matter how forcefully he projects his beard. Chaplin steps into frame to give Edna a prop, but still can't get her to be as cool and dismissive as he would like. An exasperated Chaplin repositions Edna's arm. Eric, showing a professionalism garnered after years on the stage, seems unfazed by Edna's inability to give the required performance. After more than 30 takes, Edna and Eric are still at it. But now Eric is obviously saying something to Edna to make her laugh. They'll have to start all over again. Sometimes Charlie would start shooting an idea and then abandon it. This isolated sequence shows Eric and Edna in a bohemian cafe. Eric has been given the opportunity to broaden his range, playing a dashing Svengali figure with Edna under his spell. Albert Austin, on the right, challenges him to a duel. And for once, Eric actually gets to kiss Edna, who appears to rather enjoy the experience. But for whatever reason, could Charlie have been jealous? The idea is abandoned. Charlie starts all over again with Slate 1, using the same set but little else. Now Charlie is a penniless diner who can barely afford a meal. He's being intimidated by an arrogant, bullying waiter played by Henry Bergman. Eric, as yet, has no part. Bergman is called on to beat up a customer who can't pay his bill. It looks like Charlie can't pay either. Charlie does scene after scene and take after take, but something isn't working. Bergman just can't give the right sense of threat to the role. It doesn't provide Charlie with the right foil. They just don't spark. So in the next take, he makes a change. Eric's presence immediately brings Chaplin's performance to life. His actions become broader and funny. Relieved at having cracked his casting problem, even Chaplin seems to be enjoying himself. And behind this clapperboard we get a tantalising glimpse of Eric relaxing, the man behind the ferocious mask.
From 1915 on, there was in this country an enormous Chaplin craze where there were songs written about Chaplin or about his walk. You had little dolls that were coming out in the shape of Chaplin. You had Chaplin look-alike contests where thousands of people would turn out in their Chaplin costumes, or at least hundreds would, at a theater, and then the winner might get a certain prize or whatever. So you had this enormous interest. With the increased fascination with Chaplin, there was just a huge number of Chaplin imitators that appeared out of nowhere. You had Stan Laurel, who had worked with Charlie Chaplin at Carno, doing a little Keystone Trio, which was sort of Stan Laurel as Charlie Chaplin, which I think would be marvelously wonderful to see. In fact, there was one fellow named Charles Amador who used the name Charlie Chaplin. And that definitely galled Charles Chaplin, the idea that someone would use the name Charles Chaplin.
Among the imitators was a Glasgow comedian called Billy Ritchie. Ritchie had preceded Chaplin in many of the roles at Carno and claimed, perhaps with some truth, that he was in fact the original of the little tramp figure, and that Chaplin had imitated him in his walk and costume. Unfortunately, Ritchie met a rather gruesome end before his film career really took off, when he was attacked and fatally injured by a group of ostriches on the set of one of his films.
As soon as you had Chaplin imitation and Chaplin imitators, you began to have Eric Campbell imitators. Oliver Hardy was hired by Billy West to do a bit of the Eric Campbell routine with the large mustaches or beards where you could hardly even see Oliver Hardy underneath all that makeup.
Chaplin's popularity was hardly limited to North America. He had become a universally recognised figure. And so, of course, had Eric, who was known to millions of children around the world as Big Uncle Eric, even back in his homeland.
My impression of those early days, I was only kind of very young, that there were certainly gales of laughter because Chaplin was at his peak then. And at that time, a cinema sheet activated by a whistle being blown was run across the stage, and it was just a linen sheet, and pegged down on the opposite side, and then a short film was projected on the screen, whilst behind the screen the stage was being set for the variety act, monocyclist or performing dogs or something like that. The reaction to Chaplin was very, very good indeed, but the reason being, basically, that there was a great deal of knockabout and action practically the whole time, particularly with custard pies, etc., flying around, particularly in the face of the bewhiskered kind of villain, Eric Campbell.
I answered about Eric getting 2 years' contract with Charlie Chaplin, and if the war is over, the second year is travel to China, Egypt, Japan, Australia, etc. Both Una and self included, me only small bits. Take no notice of press matter because they print anything. Charlie Chaplin is going to take the best offer, you can bet, only he likes Eric so well that he was upset to know he had some 3 good offers from other movie people. He telephoned us to go to lunch at their best hotel there, gave Eric his terms, etc., rushed Eric off to a lawyer to sign the contract. Now it's as sweet as anything to Eric. Many people said here Charlie Chaplin had Eric to thank for his pictures, yet Charlie Chaplin cut half of Eric's good work out when the pictures were shown.
Just as Eric's career was blossoming, his personal life took a tragic turn from which it would never recover.
His wife, whom he had married in Scotland and brought to this country, passed away rather suddenly. And he and his daughter were in a car accident, and his daughter went to recuperate at a friend's house. And while his daughter was recuperating, he met this woman at a party, and about 3 weeks later, they were married. This was like a month after his wife had passed away.
Cleta Pearl Gilman was a beautiful young Southern belle with theatrical pretensions and a reputation as a gold digger. The marriage was a surprise to all. Even Chaplin wasn't told until after the event, and Eric's daughter Una only found out when she returned home from her friends a few days later. Pearl had been part of a vaudeville singing group with 2 of her sisters. They traded on the name of a more famous sibling, sexpot Mabel Gilman Corrie, who had gained notoriety by marrying elderly steel magnate W.E. Corrie. But admiration was not to last. 2 months later, Cupid and comedy failed to mix, according to Mrs. Cleta Pearl Campbell, sister of Mrs. Mabel Gilman Corrie, who will seek separate maintenance from her husband Eric Campbell, well-known film comedian.
Doing some research, I came across the divorce complaint, which by today's standards was rather tame, but in those days, I guess this was hot stuff, I don't know, but in part, this was part of her divorce complaint. This is why she divorced Eric Campbell. That since said marriage, defendant has treated plaintiff in a cruel and inhuman manner, and in particular as follows. That on or about the 3rd day of October 1917, at the home of plaintiff and defendant, and in the presence and hearing of friends of the plaintiff, defendant cursed the plaintiff and said to her, "God damn you, take your feet down," and struck plaintiff and hurt, shamed, and humiliated her. That while at the cafe in the town of Vernon, the defendant insisted on introducing, and did introduce, the plaintiff to a hula dancer, against the objection of the plaintiff, and said he liked hula dancers and that they were just as good as she was. That the defendant is a steady and excessive drinker of intoxicating liquors, and on nearly every night following the marriage of the plaintiff and defendant, the defendant has returned home in an intoxicated condition and cursed and abused the plaintiff and frightened and humiliated her. That the defendant is a large and powerful man and boasts continually of his physical prowess, and repeatedly told the plaintiff that he had on one occasion killed a man with a single blow of his fist and threatened to kill her.
Do you believe all of that?
Well, I don't know, that hula dancer stuff is a little hard to take. But, well, he was a big, powerful man. I mean, that's very true. I mean, it's very obvious from his interactions with Chaplin, but from what I've heard from what other people said about him, he was a very gentle and sweet man.
Eric moved out of his house in Santa Monica and took an apartment next to Chaplin's own in the exclusive Los Angeles Athletic Club. We can only guess if he confided his obvious unhappiness to Chaplin. What is for sure is that he never displayed anything but a professional attitude on the set, where most were unaware of his private anguish. All during this period, Eric was at work in what would be Chaplin's final film for Mutual, and also one of his funniest, The Adventurer. At the very end of the film, there is a moment that, with hindsight, is immensely poignant. Chaplin kisses Eric goodbye. Having completed his Mutual contract, Chaplin was determined to further extend his independence by building his very own film studio. Chaplin, Eric and the others gather round on the day the construction work began. So excited was Chaplin with the idea of having his own studio that he had his cameraman, Rolly Tothero, make this film, showing it going up. Construction was scheduled to take 5 months, during which time Eric was still under contract and being paid a hefty salary. To offset this expense, Charlie agreed to loan Eric out to his friend Mary Pickford for her latest film, Amaryllis of Clothesline Alley. Although he was still being asked to play a villain, this was an enormous break into dramatic acting for Eric. Remember that at the time Pickford, America's sweetheart, was the most popular actress in the world. But 3 days into shooting Amaryllis, Eric, increasingly erratic and reckless in his behaviour, went to a lively party at the Vernon Country Club. Drunk, he drove back with some friends at 4 o'clock in the morning. When he hit the oncoming vehicle, he was travelling at 60 miles an hour on the wrong side of the road. He was killed instantly. His passengers escaped with minor injuries.
I'm afraid when Eric Campbell died in the automobile accident, it was, in some ways, I'm sure Chaplin must have not only had a great personal loss at that, but also realized, I'm in trouble. Where am I ever going to find someone who could replace this man? And I don't think he ever found anyone that ever replaced Eric Campbell because of Campbell being such a superior comedian and heavy.
He never found another villain quite like Campbell. There was usually an opponent, a heavy, but you don't really remember them. They're bits of machinery, not such a strong personality as Campbell. And I think that if Campbell had survived, the relationship, the artistic relationship they built up would have developed, and I think that, something quite wonderful and rich might have come out of it. And Chaplin was not the character ever to acknowledge a partner, but I think that there would have been something quite close to a partnership if Eric had lived.
Without Eric's more manic influence, Chaplin's films grew progressively more self-obsessed and sentimental. They never again had the wild, inventive, iconoclastic, even cruel humour of the Mutual films, the ones which many Chaplin admirers now regard as his greatest achievement. Stan Laurel, one of Eric's greatest friends, later said, "Eric was such a wonderful guy. People used to say that he had a heart as big as himself, and Eric was a mountain of a man. I think he would have made a great success in the movies when sound came in because he had a beautiful big voice, again, just like himself. The odd thing, though, was that he was really a very shy man, like Charlie in that respect. Eric used to refer to himself as an elephant. I guess in a way he was right. Big, gentle, lovable."
When my mother had both her parents die within such a short space of time, and not having any relatives in America, she was forced, I presume, through having nowhere to go, to come back to England, and she went to stay with her aunt in Nottingham, who looked after her, because I think she was only about 15 at the time, and she was left with no prospects really, so she had to get a job as a window dresser. On occasion I've said to people, "Did you see my grandfather on television last night?" And they'd say, "No, who was that?" And you'd say, "Well, you saw the Charlie Chaplin films are on." They'd say, "Yes." And I say, "Well, the very big man, the opposite, that's my grandfather," and nobody believes you, which is a bit depressing because it's rather difficult to prove, isn't it?
Rosedale was one of the first cemeteries to allow people of all color, creed, religions to be buried in one location. We have many famous people here, just a few I'll name today. Hattie McDaniels, who is the first African-American actress to receive an Academy Award for her portrayal in Gone with the Wind. We have Ray Bradbury, who's a famous writer. We also have Frederick Ringe, who is one of the founders of Pacific Mutual Insurance Company. And now we have, of course, Mr. Alfred Eric Campbell to add to that list of famous people interred here at Rosedale. Mr. Campbell was cremated in December 1917, and some 6 months later, the undertaker who handled his service picked up his ashes. He was to have been interred in a niche in our columbarium, but apparently for some reason we suspect that possibly it wasn't paid for, so he had to go back to the handling mortuary. So the undertaker kept him for some 21 years. He returned the cremains to us some 21 years later, and we kept them here for an additional 13 years before we finally interred them on our grounds. And again, none of the relatives contacted us apparently, so he was interred on our grounds, and we're not quite sure where, but he was interred here, and he's part of the beautiful scenery you see here, our trees and the flowers, and we'd like to think of him like that. And finally, some 44 years later, as you know, today we're going to place his memorial plaque to put him finally to rest.
good. I liked the bit with the big Scottish guy where he was like beating everybody up. I liked the my eyebrows kept going up and down.
Well, I've been into silent movies and especially Charlie Chaplin for quite a while actually, and I watched quite a few Charlie Chaplins when I was young.
Well, I think that's an old-fashioned Mr. Bean.
I think quite a lot of the modern ones just take off it because a lot of the modern ones is the bad guy chases the good guy, but the good guy wins.
It was scary.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. He sort of put the excitement into the film. He brought all the violence into it as well.
My first impression when I was told that it was black and white films, I thought it would be quite boring, but it turned out it was really good, and I saw that he didn't really need the words.
Were they fake eyebrows? Yeah. That sort of comedy will always be funny.